Hello YouTube, and welcome to the second installment of my Odds and Ends series. Let's dive into the first topic. About a month ago, I received some questions from a viewer, and because they're really good questions, I decided to make a video to answer them. They deal with questions of epistemology and theology. So let's begin. Question 1. There's an argument that the success of science using methodological naturalism is evidence of metaphysical naturalism because if the method succeeds, this indicates the object being studied is inherently similar to the method. What's your take? So if I understand the thrust of this question, it basically makes the following argument. Naturalism, by which is meant a view of the universe where there is nothing outside the material world, and that the material world is governed by natural processes such as the laws of physics, laws of motion, cause and effect, etc., is the assumption of the scientific method. Given that the scientific method seems to be a successful predictive model of the universe, it seems to follow that naturalism is true. In conclusion, there is probably nothing outside the material world. Now, I think there are a couple possible ways to respond to this argument. The first is to deny the minor premise. It's true that the scientific method has given us great technological advances, but I don't think technological advances equates to a complete vindication of metaphysical naturalism. The fact that science produces working technology demonstrates to us that the scientific method is in some sense true. It produces consistent, repeatable results, but it does not show that metaphysical naturalism is a complete view of the universe. To give an analogy, you could imagine a scientist who only uses microscopes. This scientist has phenomenal successes in chemistry, microbiology, and all manner of sciences studying very small things. It would be reasonable for a scientist to say that microscopes can help us see things about the world we otherwise wouldn't and to create working models of the micro parts of our world. It would be very silly for that scientist, however, to argue, well, my microscope has a proven track record of success, so we know it's a good way to look at the world, and I've never seen elephants, planets, or houses under my microscope. It therefore follows that elephants, planets, and houses don't exist. If they did, I would see them with my microscope. Microscopes can be a good way to look at the world, but it does not follow that they are the only way to look at the world, or that everything in the world is observable through a microscope. Similarly, the scientific method is a good way to learn about the world. It is not the only way to learn about the world, and not everything about the world can be learned through the scientific method. Another response is that the scientific method actually relies on the existence of metaphysical properties in the universe. The scientific method makes assumptions about the universe that are themselves non-testable, and imply the existence of non-natural causes. The best example of this is the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason states that for every fact F, there must be a sufficient reason for F to be the case. We imply it every time we use the scientific method or any time we ask the question why. If an earthquake happens, we believe that there is a physical reason for why that earthquake happened, and by studying earthquakes, we can learn about the causes of earthquakes. The fact that we believe that earthquakes can be studied in this way implies that we believe in the principle of sufficient reason. We don't believe we live in a universe where things happen randomly without any cause or reason why. Furthermore, the scientific method depends on repeatability. Systems of peer review presume that if a scientist gets one result from an experiment in one location, then other scientists should get the same result from the same experiment in different locations, once you control for confounding variables like temperature, pressure, and altitude. This seems obvious, but is actually quite remarkable. The fact that physical laws are consistent throughout the universe seems to imply that the universe behaves as a unitary whole. It's not a collection of random parts, but a system that obeys fundamental laws that are not parts of our universe, but outside of and governing parts of it. These 2 points imply a metaphysical order in the universe. The success of science is therefore an argument for the existence of a metaphysical order to the universe, not against it. Question 2. The problem with theistic metaphysics is that such ideas are unfalsifiable. And if we go with unfalsifiable ideas, then how do we separate ludicrous questions from legitimate ones? The thrust of this argument is basically, it seems that some beliefs about God or the metaphysical order are unfalsifiable. Why should we believe them? The first point to make is that unfalsifiability as a criterion for belief gets tricky. After all, how can you prove that a belief is falsifiable? Well, by falsifying it, by proving that it's not true. But then if you have proven it's not true, why should you believe it? So therefore, can you believe anything at all? Another question is unfalsifiable for whom? There are many beliefs I have about the physical world that I cannot or don't want to empirically test. I believe I can't hold my breath for over 10 minutes. I believe that if I mix bleach and vinegar together, I'll make chlorine gas. I believe that light behaves as both a particle and a wave, and I believe that if I die in a state of mortal sin, I will go to hell. Now, these beliefs all appear to be very different, but one thing they have in common is that I am personally not able to test them with the tools and knowledge I have readily available to me. Now, for the first three, I can say, well, I might not be able to test these beliefs, but I've been told that scientists have tested these, and every time they've tested them, they've failed to falsify them. So as long as I trust the scientists and the media and the universities that tell me what the scientists are doing, I can probably trust them on these particular beliefs. And in general, I do believe I can trust scientists, the media, and the universities, at least on some questions, some of the time. Thus, I can believe things not just because of the scientific method, but because of the community of truth finding and truth communicating that I'm a part of. And that's also true for the fourth claim. I can't test that if I die an unrepentant sinner, I will go to hell, or at least I'm not interested in attempting to test it. But it is what I've been told by the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church has made a variety of claims about different topics, and through experience, I've found that the claims of the Catholic Church that are falsifiable have been true, or at least that the worldview of Catholicism has more explanatory power than an atheistic worldview, a Hindu worldview, a Jewish worldview, or even a Lutheran worldview, etc. So to answer the question, how do we separate reasonable, unfalsifiable ideas from ludicrous ones, I'd say we have a variety of methods. Logically, beliefs that are at least internally consistent, that is, not self-contradictory, are more likely to be true than beliefs that are not. Historically, beliefs that come from sources with track records of beliefs that haven't been falsified are more likely to be true than beliefs that come from sources known to have been wrong more often than they've been right. And parsimoniously, Occam's razor would tell us that explanations that require fewer sufficient causes should be preferred to explanations that multiply them unnecessarily. I'm sure there are more, but you get the idea. There are more ways to assess beliefs than simply falsifiability. Question 3. If God is all-knowing and all-powerful, then does that mean he knows creating the universe leads to conflict such as seismic fault? And while it can be argued that this is part of creation, since for example the plates that cause earthquakes also create our atmosphere, couldn't God, being all-knowing and all-powerful, create different physical laws so that creation isn't directly or indirectly dependent on imprecise processes to achieve the telos? So if I understand this question, it's basically a more sophisticated version of the problem of evil. Basically, if God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, then we should not expect there to be evil in the world. But there is evil in the world. Therefore, God is not all-knowing, all-powerful, or all-good. A typical response to this argument is to point out, like the example used, that some apparent evils are necessary for good, i.e., sure, earthquakes that kill people are bad, but earthquakes are caused by seismic processes that are apparently necessary for the creation of an atmosphere that supports life. So the question raised here is it possible for God to create a world with an atmosphere that can sustain life, but doesn't have earthquakes that kill people? And the first point to make is that it's somewhat possible now. Sure, some seismic activity is unpredictable, but for the most part, we generally know that seismic activity occurs across seismic faults. Humans continue to choose to live across seismic faults, increasing the death totals from earthquakes. Sure, it would take a lot of sacrifice, but if reducing deaths from earthquakes was a priority for us, we could relocate entire cities off of seismic faults and greatly reduce death tolls from earthquakes simply by not living where earthquakes happen. Now, this isn't really what the question was asking about, but I think it is an important part to make, that even natural deaths often have an element of human free will. More to the point, however, it's a good question whether it's possible to create a world with an atmosphere that can sustain life and no dangerous seismic activity. I don't think so, but I don't know. It might be that atmospheres that can sustain life and seismic activity are like triangles and having three sides. It would be silly to say that God's not all-powerful since he can't make a triangle that has more than three sides, since that's logically impossible. It might similarly be logically impossible to create a world with an atmosphere that supports life with no seismic activity. But let's suppose it is possible. Would there be a reason why a good God might choose to create a world with earthquakes versus a world with no earthquakes, even knowing that his beloved creation will suffer because of these earthquakes? Well, while it's true that earthquakes have caused great suffering, earthquakes have also led to human development, both intellectual, technological, and even moral. You can't have people who courageously run into danger to save people if you don't have danger in the first place. Yes, it may be physically possible for God to create a world with no natural danger, but would human beings be any different than cows in a pasture? Nothing against cows, but I think we understand there's something beautiful about the way human beings will risk their lives to save each other from Mother Nature in a way cows just don't. I don't propose to understand the mind of God, but it seems quite reasonable to me that, if presented two options, creating a species that can practice self-sacrificial love, even if it requires the death of many members of that species, versus creating a species that experiences no unnatural death, but doesn't develop beyond the moral state of a cow, that God might choose the first, and it wouldn't necessarily be immoral for him to do so. Now, some people may say that this is callous, that no god could be called good by demanding sacrifice from its creation, or that God would be a tyrant in this situation. In operating on natural reason alone, it's hard to avoid this conclusion. But this is where, as Christians, we are presented with the mystery of the cross. The Christian God, unlike the God of the Jews and the God of the Muslims, doesn't demand sacrifice because it's rightfully his, although it is. In Christianity, God himself died for the sins of man, and in doing so defeated death. In Christianity, sacrifice is not merely the respect that creation owes to its creator, it is elevated as the pivotal act of creation itself, the act by which man becomes most like God. God, in sacrificing himself for man, has turned the act of sacrifice from an act of servile worship into a participation in the life of God himself. And those of us on the dissident right should be particularly aware of this. If you're concerned with beauty, goodness, and order, and want to see a world where these things exist, you can't escape the fundamental reality that these things exist first in God, and then in the world only insofar as we participate in the life of God. So underneath all the philosophy, economic theory, and political praxis, to be a good dissident, you need to go to church, read scripture, and have routines of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, because it is these things that will win the war for us. Everything else is window dressing. A few days ago, Academic Agent made a video where he argued that the slippery slope argument is not a fallacy. His argument is based on a misunderstanding of what the slippery slope argument is. While I agree with his ultimate conclusion that the slippery slope fallacy is rescuable, that it is possible to turn it into a valid argument, I think it's important to understand why Academic Agent's method of doing so fails, what the slippery slope actually is, and what's actually going on here. This is not done out of any animus for Academic Agent, who I very much respect, but because logic is one of those things which we can't afford to make mistakes in. Before we begin, I think it's important to restate something that Academic Agent said in his video. It's possible for an argument to produce a true conclusion without being valid, and it is possible for a valid argument to be wrong if the premises are unsound. This is important to understand because it will help us see the real problem with the slippery slope argument. In Academic Agent's video, he argued that the form of the slippery slope argument is as follows. If A, then B, A, therefore B. As he stated in his video, this is an example of a basic modus ponens. It is not just a valid argument, but the first and most basic valid argument that's taught in logic. He gives the following example from a textbook he read. Immediate steps should be taken to outlaw pornography once and for all. The continued manufacture and sale of pornographic material will almost certainly lead to an increase in sex-related crimes such as rape and incest. This in turn will gradually erode the moral fabric of society and result in an increase of crimes of all sorts. Eventually, a complete disintegration of law and order will occur, leading in the end to the total collapse of civilization. Academic Agent constructs the argument roughly in the following manner. If the sale of pornography continues, then sex-related crimes will increase. If sex-related crimes increase, then the moral fabric of society will erode. If the moral fabric of society erodes, then law and order will collapse. If law and order collapses, then civilization will end. Therefore, if the sale of pornography continues, then civilization will end. Academic Agent rightly points out that this argument, whether we agree with it or not, is valid. The premises might be right or wrong, but the logic is a basic hypothetical syllogism of the modus ponens variety. If A then B, if B then C, if C then D, if D then E, therefore, if A, then E. The argument presented by academic agent is valid and not fallacious, but in fact this is not the correct analysis of the argument presented in the text. The conclusion of the argument is not, leading in the end to the total collapse of civilization. The conclusion of the argument is, immediate steps should be taken to outlaw pornography. And that is a conclusion that is not explicitly supported by the premises. What academic agent gets wrong is that the slippery slope argument is not simply a sequence of events. It necessarily makes a moral claim. This moral claim may be true or false, but it is a non sequitur. It is not logically demanded by the premises. What makes the argument technically fallacious is that it argues that because one action, event, or policy leads to a bad, undesirable, or immoral result, that makes the action, event, or policy bad, undesirable, and immoral as well. This is not necessarily the case. For example, consider the following argument. If we do not restrict free speech, some people will say mean things. People saying mean things is undesirable, therefore we should restrict free speech. Now, the premises of this argument are certainly true. People will say mean things if we do not restrict free speech, and people saying mean things is generally undesirable. So, do we agree with the conclusion? Personally, no. The reason for this is that even if people saying mean things is undesirable, it does not follow that we should restrict free speech. Therefore, the conclusion is a non sequitur. It does not follow from the premises. We can use another example. If you deny your faith, the emperor won't kill your family. You don't want your family to die, therefore you should deny your faith. The premises appear to be true, or at least the first premise would be true if we were 3rd century Roman Christians. And yet the conclusion is not one that we as 3rd century Roman Christians would find acceptable. So what's wrong with this argument? Well, it's actually kind of subtle, but a third example should explain it. A hint is that the slippery slope is not fallacious because of an error in logical form, it's fallacious due to its minor premise. Consider, if you smoke, you will raise your risk for heart disease. Heart disease is bad for you, therefore you shouldn't smoke. Have you spotted the problem? If you're a smoker, you probably have. It's undeniably true that smoking raises your risk for heart disease, and I don't think there's anyone who is pro-heart disease. So why do smokers choose to smoke? Addiction aside, obviously. It's not that they're not aware of health risks. Every smoker has seen the same commercials you have, sat in the same health classes you have, and smokers are just as intelligent as non-smokers. Some people just decide that the pleasure from smoking is worth the increased risk of heart disease. They have different values than non-smokers. And this is the problem of the slippery slope argument. The argument is used to convince a person to take or not take a course of action based on the consequences of that action. But this presumes that the person you're trying to convince shares the same values you do. A smoker knows that smoking increases the risk for heart disease. They're not stupid. They simply choose smoking and increased risk of heart disease instead of not smoking and not increasing the risk of heart disease. A 3rd century Christian doesn't need to be told that if they deny their faith, they could save their family. They are painfully aware of that fact. They simply believe that they have a higher ethical duty to God than to their family. The slippery slope argument is fallacious because even agreeing with the premises, there's nothing in the argument that compels the conclusion. Now, how do we fix the slippery slope argument? The problem is not, as academic agent suggests later in his video, in the major premise. The problem is, as I said earlier, in the minor premise. It's true in the smoking example that I don't want to raise my risk for heart disease, but the unstated assumption is that my desire not to raise my risk for heart disease is a stronger motivator than my desire to smoke. For the argument to be valid, that hidden assumption needs to be stated. Perhaps something like this. If you smoke, you will raise your risk for heart disease. Raising your risk for heart disease is worse than quitting smoking. Therefore, you should quit smoking. Now, the argument is valid. You may agree or disagree with the minor premise, but in this example, if you agree with both premises, you logically have to agree with the conclusion, which was not true of the original argument. We can therefore logically render the argument as, if A then B, where A is a given action and B is a consequence of that action, the negative consequences of B are worse than any negative consequence of A, therefore not A. Stated like this, the slippery slope argument is valid, but clearly much less emotionally powerful. So what's going on here? Essentially, the minor premise of the slippery slope argument relies on vague language. It often will say things like X is bad or undesirable, but it doesn't tell you what it's bad or undesirable in relation to. Simply saying X is bad can allow the person making the slippery slope argument to shift a conditional negative, something that is bad only in relation to other things, into a universal negative, something that is totally bad. You can see this if you use a silly example. If you eat food, then you risk being poisoned. Risking being poisoned is bad, Therefore, you shouldn't eat food. Obviously, this is absurd. And it's made clear when you change the minor premise. If you eat food, then you risk being poisoned. Risking being poisoned is worse than starving to death. Therefore, you shouldn't eat food. Obviously, one would prefer not to risk being poisoned than taking the risk, all other things being equal, but taking that risk is not so bad that one should refuse eating in totality. By making the minor premise a direct comparison between the two options being discussed, the slippery slope argument is turned into a valid argument, but it's also revealed as a much weaker argument than it appears. By weaker argument, I mean the only people it's going to convince are those who already agree with you. Consider the original example Academic Agent used with the completing syllogism. If the sale of pornography continues, then sex-related crimes will increase. If sex-related crimes increase, then the moral fabric of society will erode. If the moral fabric of society erodes, then law and order will collapse. If law and order collapses, then civilization will end. Therefore, if the sale of pornography continues, then civilization will end. Civilization ending is worse than pornography being banned. Therefore, we should ban pornography. Now, who are the two kinds of people we might want to convince that pornography should be banned? People who like pornography, and people who oppose banning stuff. But people who like pornography are going to reject the idea that pornography contributes to sex-related crimes and general societal decay, and principled libertarians are going to simply bite the bullet and say that even if failing to ban pornography leads to the end of civilization, it would still be wrong to ban pornography. So this argument is convincing only to those who don't need to be convinced, and I believe this is a flaw of all slippery slope style arguments. Therefore, even if the slippery slope can be rescued and turned into a valid argument, it's still not a useful one. Finally, in recent weeks, many YouTubers on the dissident right have been talking about next steps we need to take. I'm thinking about the latest live streams put out by Distributist, Charlemagne, Settlers Lament, Don the Pleb, Ubersoy, and Prudentialist. Though there is some disagreement on the finer points, everyone seems united that we have to find ways to meet and build communities IRL. I'm not going to review these videos because you should watch them yourself, and I 100% agree with them. The problem we have all come up against is how do we make ourselves more available in real life when we are so spread out, without also making ourselves vulnerable to people who want to dox us or cause us other kinds of harm. Essentially, how do those of us who are on record with wrongthink find good people near us without compromising our identities to people we don't want to trust? Now, I don't have a big spiel on this, nor do I pretend to have a magic bullet, but if some of the bigger names on the dissident right agree, the following might provide one way to help the process. In the 18th and 19th century, an important social ritual was the letter of introduction. Essentially, it was considered impolite to interact with someone unless you had already been formally introduced by a third party. This could be done in person or oftentimes through letters of introduction. A person, typically of a lower class, would request a letter from a person of a higher class who knew them, introducing them to another member of high class as someone who could be trusted and someone who had useful skills to bring to the table. Think of them as job recommendations from former employers, but also for the purpose of social interaction, not just business. Now, we can dispense with the notion of class that these usually had attributed to them, since those of us outside the cathedral are all outside of the high class that really matters today. But I think these could be a useful way of expanding our circle of trust in the real world. Essentially, those of us who have gone on record as dissidents and who have made IRL contact with others who have gone on record as dissidents can be vetters for each other. In the past, I have met IRL with Distributist, Charlemagne, and Don the Pleb. They know who I am, and I know I can trust them. If one of them were to recommend to me someone they know and trust as someone I could work with, I would trust their judge of character. Now, the mechanics of how this would work are something we can work out, but I'm thinking something like this. If someone hit me up on social media and asked to hang out with me out of the blue, I'd be happy to meet them at a restaurant, a coffee shop, or generally anywhere away from my house, and I'd be circumspect with what information I share. After we've built up more of a relationship and I know they're sincere in their dissident beliefs and they have some useful skills, I know I'll be able to trust them and we can begin working together. If, however, they came to me with a letter of introduction signed by Distributist, Charlemagne, or Don the Pleb, and I contacted them and verified the authenticity of the letter, I'd know I can trust them right away. And I'd be willing to travel to meet others like Settlers Lament and Prudentialist IRL to set up the same kind of agreement with them if that's something they would like to do. So to any of those content creators I mentioned, or to any content creators I neglected to mention, if this is a system that you guys think is workable and something you would like to do, let me know and we can hash out the details. To make this work, however, one thing that will need to be public information is what locations dissident right content creators are willing to travel to meet with people multiple multiple times, which necessarily means revealing something about the geographic area in which we live. So, I'll go first. I'm willing to meet anyone at a location in the greater DC area, so if you live within traveling distance of that and want to meet up, let me know. I can't promise that I'll always be available to meet, but if you hit me up, I can promise that I'll make a sincere effort to schedule something with you and meet up with you within a month. I know that Distributist and Charlemagne believe getting IRL networks established is our priority, and I hope this suggestion is a way that we can get this thing moving. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments. Until next time, I'm Benedict the 17th. Go with God.